The first rumors reached Blackthorne Hall before the carriage ever crossed the county line. In the servants' hall, where polished copper gleamed beside crackling hearths and whispered gossip traveled faster than the morning bells, maids, footmen, and stable hands exchanged knowing smiles. Another duchess was coming. Another elegant ornament chosen by titled families who believed embroidered gowns prepared a lady for a household built upon rigid customs and impossible expectations. Outside, ancient oaks swayed beneath a pale April sky, while the vast estate stretched across emerald fields like a kingdom untouched by time. Within its towering stone walls, every clock chimed with military precision, every curtain hung without a wrinkle, and every servant measured each breath against the Duke's exacting standards. Blackthorne Hall did not simply demand obedience. It consumed weakness without apology. Duke Alistair Ashcombe stood alone in the Western Library, gazing across rain-darkened gardens where marble statues watched silently over clipped hedges and winding paths. At 36, he possessed the quiet authority of a man who had inherited privilege alongside relentless duty. His dark coat fit with flawless precision, yet no elegance softened the sternness etched into his features. Since his father's death, discipline had become both shield and prison, and the estate reflected its master with almost unsettling perfection. Behind him stood Mr. Edwin Graves, the elderly butler whose loyalty had outlived 3 generations of Ashcombes. Graves held a silver tray bearing untouched tea, though he understood better than anyone that the Duke rarely noticed food when burdened by thought. "The carriage should arrive before luncheon, Your Grace," Graves said gently. Alistair never turned from the window. "She won't last a month here." The words were spoken without bitterness or arrogance. They carried only weary certainty, as though he were commenting upon the weather rather than the future of his bride. Graves lowered his eyes. "Perhaps," he answered carefully, "every season eventually surprises us." The Duke gave no reply. Within minutes the remark slipped beyond the library walls. A footman mentioned it while polishing silver. A kitchen maid repeated it while kneading bread. Stable boys laughed as they brushed restless horses. Before the church clock struck 11, nearly every servant knew their master believed his new duchess would fail before summer flowers fully bloomed. Friendly wagers appeared almost immediately. Some predicted 3 weeks. Others generously allowed 6. No one imagined she would endure the endless expectations that had broken stronger spirits before her. The carriage finally appeared through the estate gates beneath drifting clouds and flowering chestnut trees. Its wheels rolled slowly along the gravel drive while rows of servants assembled before the entrance in perfect formation. The great oak doors opened together with ceremonial grace. Every face remained respectfully composed, though curious eyes searched the carriage windows. They expected dazzling jewels, fashionable extravagance, or timid hesitation. Instead, Lady Eleanor Whitmore stepped onto the stone terrace wearing a traveling gown of soft blue trimmed with modest ivory lace. Her attire was refined without demanding admiration, and beneath a neatly tied bonnet, intelligent gray eyes calmly surveyed the enormous residence before her. She neither shrank from its grandeur nor stared with childish wonder. She simply observed, breathing deeply as spring air carried scents of damp earth, blooming roses and distant rain. She smiled first at the servants. "Good morning," she said warmly. "You have waited long enough in this breeze because of me." "Thank you." Several exchanged puzzled glances. Aristocratic ladies usually greeted the house before acknowledging those who maintained it. Mr. Graves stepped forward. "Welcome to Blackthorne Hall, Your Grace." She extended her gloved hand. "You must be Mr. Graves. My father often said no estate truly belongs to its owner. It belongs to the people wise enough to keep it standing." The old butler blinked in quiet surprise before bowing respectfully. Inside the entrance hall, towering portraits watched from gilded frames while crystal chandeliers scattered morning light across polished marble floors. Eleanor moved with measured elegance, noticing details others overlooked. She admired fresh lilies arranged beside the staircase, complimented a young maid on perfectly polished brass, and thanked 2 footmen for carrying her trunks. By the time she reached the drawing room, she had remembered nearly every servant's name after hearing it only once. News of that small miracle spread almost as quickly as the Duke's earlier prediction. Their first dinner unfolded beneath glittering candlelight as distinguished neighbors gathered to welcome the new Duchess. Silver reflected warm flames, crystal glasses shimmered like captured stars, and conversation floated politely above hidden judgment. Eleanor answered questions with grace until an elderly countess deliberately asked whether she knew the centuries-old custom requiring every Duchess of Blackthorne to begin the evening by serving the Duke wine herself. Eleanor had never been informed. Silence settled around the table. Embarrassment hovered expectantly. She rose calmly. "Then allow tonight to be remembered not for my ignorance," she said softly, lifting the crystal decanter with steady hands, "but for my willingness to learn what should have been taught." She poured the wine without spilling a drop. Even the Countess seemed robbed of further criticism. Later that evening, while unfamiliar corridors echoed beneath flickering lamps, Eleanor heard muffled sobbing beyond the kitchens. She found a trembling young maid staring at shattered porcelain scattered across the floor like fragments of winter ice. The girl's cheeks glistened with frightened tears. "I've broken the Duchess Rose service," she whispered. "Mr. Wilcox will dismiss me before dawn." Without hesitation, Eleanor knelt beside her despite the expensive silk pooling against cold stone. "Then we shall share the blame." Before the astonished girl could protest, Eleanor gathered several broken pieces into her own hands just as the head steward entered, his stern expression already prepared for punishment. "I dropped the tray," Eleanor said with quiet conviction. "The fault is mine." The steward looked utterly bewildered. No duchess had ever accepted disgrace for a servant. Hidden within the shadows beyond the doorway, Mr. Graves witnessed everything in complete silence. After everyone departed, he carefully collected the remaining porcelain instead of discarding it. Holding the fractured pieces beneath gentle lamplight, he remembered the Duke's certainty that this remarkable woman would not survive Blackthorne Hall. Yet as distant thunder murmured across the spring sky, the old butler found himself smiling with unexpected hope, wondering whether the house, rather than its newest mistress, might prove the thing destined to change first. Morning arrived at Blackthorne Hall with the measured certainty of chapel bells echoing across dew-soaked lawns, yet something subtle had already begun to change. The servants still hurried through endless routines, polished silver still gleamed beneath crystal chandeliers, and the Duke's strict schedules remained untouched, but a gentler current now moved quietly beneath the estate's disciplined surface. Eleanor Whitmore neither announced reforms nor sought admiration. She simply watched, listened, and remembered. Before offering a single instruction, she spent days learning how every corner of Blackthorne Hall breathed, believing no house could truly be guided until its hidden heart had first been understood. Each morning she walked through kitchens fragrant with warm bread, herb gardens sparkling beneath fresh rain, bustling laundries clouded with fragrant steam, and echoing corridors where portraits of long-forgotten Ashcombes seemed to observe her careful progress. She greeted every servant by name, astonishing them repeatedly with her unfailing memory. When elderly gardener Thomas confessed that aching joints slowed his work, she quietly rearranged duties without wounding his pride. When young scullery maid Lucy hesitated before lifting heavy copper pots, Eleanor enlisted stronger footmen to assist her while praising Lucy's diligence instead of her weakness. No grand speeches accompanied these gestures. Kindness became her language, spoken so consistently that even suspicion struggled to answer it. Mr. Edwin Graves watched everything with growing fascination. During 4 decades of service he had witnessed duchesses who demanded obedience, admiration, or endless entertainment, yet none had invested themselves in understanding the invisible machinery sustaining the estate. Eleanor asked why candles burned all night in empty corridors, why unused linens occupied entire storerooms, why gardeners discarded vegetables too imperfect for noble tables, and why tenant families sometimes appeared at the gates requesting bread despite Blackthorne Hall's overflowing pantries. Every question revealed not criticism but genuine concern. Graves found himself answering more openly each day, sensing that she listened not to judge the past but to improve the future. Her discoveries unsettled her. Wagons carrying fresh produce often returned half full because banquets required appearance rather than necessity. Kitchens discarded untouched loaves after lavish dinners while neighboring cottages struggled through poor harvests. Flowerbeds consumed fertile ground where vegetables could also flourish without diminishing beauty. Eleanor requested no permission to pity suffering. Instead, she invited the head cook, gardeners, and housekeeper into the estate's oldest greenhouse. There, surrounded by climbing roses and warm sunlight filtering through weathered glass, she proposed quietly transforming neglected plots into thriving kitchen gardens whose harvest would nourish both manor and village alike. The suggestion astonished Mrs. Margaret Davenport, the formidable housekeeper whose loyalty to tradition rivaled the stone foundations beneath their feet. She folded her hands carefully before answering. "Your Grace, Blackthorne Hall has followed the same customs for generations." Eleanor smiled without offense. "Then perhaps tradition deserves companions instead of replacements." Mrs. Davenport studied her thoughtfully, expecting impatience or wounded pride. Instead she found calm conviction wrapped inside gentle courtesy. Against every instinct, the older woman agreed to attempt the experiment for one season. Weeks unfolded beneath brightening skies. Gardeners planted herbs beside roses. Orchard workers preserved surplus fruit rather than allowing it to spoil. Leftover bread reached tenant cottages before sunset instead of rubbish bins before dawn. Children soon appeared outside the estate carrying tiny bouquets gathered from nearby meadows. They left the flowers at the entrance gates with shy smiles before racing home laughing. Servants who had once hurried silently through endless labor now exchanged hopeful glances whenever the Duchess passed. Their work felt noticed rather than merely inspected. The changes reached Duke Alistair through account books instead of conversation. Estate expenses quietly declined while productivity increased beyond expectation. Reports praised improved harvests, healthier livestock, and unusually high morale among servants. None explained why. Sitting inside his oak-paneled study, he examined the ledgers repeatedly, convinced arithmetic must conceal an error. Efficiency rarely accompanied compassion in his experience. Yet every figure remained undeniably correct. "What explanation has Mrs. Davenport offered?" he asked Graves one afternoon. The butler allowed himself the smallest smile. "She believes your grace married an uncommon woman." Alistair closed the ledger slowly. "So I have begun to suspect." Although admiration cautiously stirred within him, London society remained eager for entertainment. Invitations arrived announcing Lady Beatrice Hawthorne's annual spring gala, where influential families gathered beneath glittering chandeliers to exchange compliments sharpened into weapons. Eleanor attended beside the Duke wearing pale ivory silk embroidered with delicate wildflowers rather than extravagant jewels. Her elegance appeared effortless, which only deepened Lady Beatrice's resentment. Throughout the evening subtle remarks drifted across polished dance floors questioning whether country charities distracted the new Duchess from proper aristocratic responsibilities. Smiles concealed malice behind impeccable manners. Finally Lady Beatrice raised her crystal glass before surrounding guests. "One wonders," she observed sweetly, "whether generosity alone qualifies one to manage a ducal household." Conversation dissolved into expectant silence. Faces turned toward Eleanor, anticipating either embarrassment or anger. Even Alistair remained motionless, uncertain whether intervention would strengthen or diminish his wife's dignity. Eleanor set down her teacup with graceful composure. "My lady," she replied, "good management should never fear examination." She turned toward the assembled guests. "Tomorrow morning Blackthorne Hall's ledgers, inventories, and charitable accounts shall be available for any respectable visitor wishing to inspect them. If I have governed carelessly, the records will reveal it. If not, perhaps kindness deserves the same fairness we grant mathematics." A murmur swept across the ballroom. Lady Beatrice's confident expression faltered for the first time that evening. Several gentlemen nodded thoughtfully, while distinguished matrons exchanged approving glances. No accusation could survive transparent truth. The following day every ledger proved immaculate. Donations balanced perfectly against savings created through wiser stewardship. Waste had diminished, tenant rents remained stable, and estate profits quietly increased. Guests departed speaking less about scandal than remarkable competence. Mrs. Davenport, once Eleanor's greatest skeptic, personally thanked the Duchess before the household staff, acknowledging that Blackthorne Hall had become stronger rather than weaker beneath her influence. The servants answered with heartfelt applause that echoed through corridors once ruled only by disciplined silence. That evening Eleanor returned to her sitting room after twilight settled softly across the gardens. Resting outside her door upon a polished walnut table lay a beautifully bound first edition of a celebrated gardening volume she had admired weeks earlier. No card accompanied the gift, no servant claimed responsibility, and no crest marked its wrapping. She traced the leather cover gently before glancing toward the darkened corridor, where unseen footsteps had already faded away. Elsewhere within Blackthorne Hall, Duke Alistair stood alone beside an upstairs window watching lantern lights spill across blooming gardens where Eleanor laughed quietly with grateful servants below, and despite himself, the stern man everyone feared discovered the unfamiliar curve of a genuine smile touching his lips at last, unseen by all except faithful Graves silently nearby. Summer settled over Blackthorne Hall with a golden warmth that softened ancient stone and filled the gardens with climbing roses, lavender, and the constant melody of songbirds hidden among emerald branches. The estate no longer carried the oppressive silence that had once defined it. Servants greeted one another with quiet confidence, children from nearby cottages occasionally laughed beyond the gates, and even the oldest corridors seemed brighter beneath open windows welcoming fragrant country air. Yet beneath this newfound harmony lingered mysteries untouched by kindness alone. Some doors remained locked, some memories remained carefully buried, and within Duke Alistair Ashcombe there still existed a loneliness no flourishing garden could erase. Eleanor sensed those unseen shadows without demanding explanations. She had learned that grief resembled old ivy clinging to forgotten walls. Pulling it away too quickly often damaged the very stones one hoped to restore. Instead, she continued guiding the household with patient steadiness while allowing the Duke his silence. Their conversations gradually lengthened beyond formal courtesies. They discussed estate improvements over breakfast, exchanged observations during evening walks, and occasionally shared thoughtful smiles that disappeared before either dared acknowledge them. Affection grew not through dramatic declarations but through countless moments of quiet understanding, each too small to describe alone yet powerful together. One warm morning repairs began within the neglected eastern wing, where generations of abandoned rooms waited behind dust-covered doors. Eleanor insisted upon inspecting the work herself, believing forgotten places often concealed forgotten responsibilities. Sunlight streamed through cracked windows as carpenters lifted warped floorboards and brushed aside decades of settled dust. The scent of aged timber mingled with lime plaster and summer blossoms drifting through broken panes. While examining a loose section near an old fireplace, Eleanor noticed an iron ring hidden beneath splintered wood. Curious, she knelt and carefully lifted the narrow panel, revealing a small cedar box tucked safely between ancient beams. The box bore no crest, only a faded brass lock already weakened by time. One carpenter offered to force it open, yet Eleanor declined. Using a slender hairpin, she gently released the rusted mechanism herself. Inside rested neatly folded letters bound with pale blue ribbon that had long since faded toward silver. A pressed white rose lay upon the bundle, astonishingly preserved despite the passing years. Eleanor unfolded only the first page before realizing the elegant handwriting belonged not to strangers but to the Duke's late mother, Duchess Catherine Ashcombe. Her heart urged caution. The opening lines spoke tenderly of home, family, and hope rather than scandal. She read only enough to understand their deeply personal nature before quietly closing the letter again. Respect outweighed curiosity. She replaced every page exactly as she had found it, smoothing the ribbon with gentle fingertips before returning the cedar box to its resting place. The hidden compartment remained open only long enough for her to whisper a silent apology for disturbing memories never intended for another's eyes. Later that afternoon Duke Alistair visited the eastern wing to inspect the renovations. A carpenter innocently mentioned discovering an old compartment beneath the floorboards. Instantly the Duke's expression hardened with alarm. He hurried toward the concealed space, fearing treasured remnants of his mother had vanished forever. Instead, he found the cedar box resting precisely where she had left it. The ribbon remained tied, the pressed rose untouched, every letter perfectly ordered. Beside the box lay only a small handwritten note in Eleanor's graceful script. Some treasures belong to memory alone. Alistair read the sentence twice before carefully folding it into his pocket. Relief gave way to something far more unfamiliar. She had possessed every opportunity to uncover secrets capable of explaining his guarded heart, yet she had chosen restraint instead. For the first time since childhood, someone had protected his vulnerability without being asked. The following evening thunderclouds gathered above Blackthorne Hall, swallowing the fading sunset beneath deep violet skies. Heavy rain soon swept across the estate, forcing Eleanor to seek shelter inside the vast glass conservatory where exotic palms and flowering orchids flourished beneath glistening panes. Moments later Alistair entered from the opposite door, equally trapped by the sudden storm. Rain drummed rhythmically overhead while lightning briefly illuminated countless droplets clinging to emerald leaves. Neither hurried to break the silence. Finally the Duke spoke. "You found the letters." She nodded gently. "I found them. You could have read every word." "I could have. And yet you did not." Eleanor met his searching gaze without hesitation. "Some grief deserves witnesses. Other grief deserves guardians." The words lingered between them more powerfully than any confession. Alistair walked slowly toward a blooming white camellia planted years before by his mother. His voice emerged quieter than she had ever heard. "My father believed houses were measured by obedience." "And your mother?" "She believed they were measured by laughter." A fragile smile touched Eleanor's lips. "She sounds wiser." He looked toward rain streaming beyond the glass. "She wanted Blackthorne Hall to feel like a home. After she died I forgot how." Eleanor stepped beside him, careful not to diminish the dignity of his sorrow. "You never forgot," she replied softly. You simply carried the burden alone for too long. The admission struck deeper than accusation ever could. For several heartbeats neither spoke. Outside, thunder rolled across distant hills while warm summer rain washed dust from ancient stone. The silence between them no longer felt guarded. It felt shared. At last Alistair turned fully toward her. "Everyone has admired this house," he said quietly. "You are the first to understand it." Eleanor lowered her eyes briefly before answering. "Homes survive because someone chooses kindness every morning." Their gazes remained locked with gentle certainty, as though years of loneliness had quietly recognized one another. Neither reached for the other, yet the distance separating them suddenly seemed smaller than ever before. The storm beyond the conservatory began to soften, leaving only silver rain shimmering across rose gardens. The peace shattered with the abrupt arrival of a soaked footman carrying the evening newspapers. Breathless, he bowed before presenting the folded edition to the Duke. Across the front page bold headlines accused Duchess Eleanor Ashcombe of secretly diverting estate funds into hidden personal accounts, alleging fraudulent charities and deliberate deception. Alistair's expression darkened as servants gathered anxiously beyond the conservatory doors. He read every poisonous line without speaking, then folded the newspaper with slow, deliberate precision. Looking once into Eleanor's unwavering eyes, he silently handed the paper to Graves before striding toward London, carrying not doubt within his heart, but a fierce resolve that promised the coming battle would no longer be fought by her alone. The accusation spread through London with astonishing speed, feeding drawing-room conversations, newspaper columns, and whispered exchanges beneath glittering chandeliers. By the time Duke Alistair Ashcombe reached the capital, the story had already grown beyond recognition. Some claimed Duchess Eleanor had emptied estate accounts to enrich forgotten relatives. Others insisted her charitable work had merely disguised years of calculated deception. Society, always hungry for elegant scandals, embraced every rumor more eagerly than the truth. Yet Alistair never paused to defend his own reputation. His thoughts remained fixed upon one woman whose greatest fault had been believing kindness could silence cruelty. Blackthorne Hall, despite its outward calm, carried the invisible weight of suspicion. Servants who had once walked with renewed confidence now lowered their voices whenever strangers approached the gates. Tenant families arrived carrying baskets of fresh bread and flowers, insisting they would never believe the Duchess capable of dishonesty, but Eleanor accepted their loyalty with quiet gratitude rather than triumphant certainty. She refused to hide from the whispers, continuing her daily routines exactly as before. Every morning she visited the gardens, inspected the kitchens, and greeted every servant by name. If dignity could be measured, hers seemed only to grow beneath pressure, polished like silver through relentless care. Mr. Edwin Graves watched her with profound admiration. During decades of service he had seen noblemen collapse beneath far smaller scandals, yet the young Duchess carried herself with remarkable composure. She neither cursed those spreading lies nor pleaded for sympathy. Instead, she reminded frightened servants that panic only strengthened falsehoods. Her steadiness became an anchor for everyone living within the estate's ancient walls. Even Mrs. Margaret Davenport, once fiercely protective of tradition, now declared openly that she would sooner question the sunrise than Eleanor's integrity. Meanwhile, Alistair moved tirelessly through London's legal offices, financial institutions, and parliamentary archives. Every ledger, receipt, and charitable account passed beneath his careful examination. Long evenings blurred into dawn as he searched for the hidden thread connecting impossible accusations. At first every document appeared flawless, almost suspiciously perfect. Then one overlooked signature caught his attention. A payment authorization supposedly approved by Eleanor had been witnessed by an accountant dismissed years before her arrival at Blackthorne Hall. The date alone exposed an impossible contradiction. He summoned the former accountant immediately. Confronted with undeniable evidence, the frightened man finally confessed that Lady Beatrice Hawthorne had paid him generously to forge records capable of destroying the Duchess's reputation. Several additional clerks admitted similar bribery. Fabricated correspondence, altered ledgers, and false newspaper leaks had all originated from the same carefully orchestrated scheme. Lady Beatrice had never sought financial gain. She had desired only to humiliate the woman whose quiet grace had eclipsed her influence within fashionable society. Graves listened silently as each confession unfolded. "So," he murmured, "envy proved more expensive than honesty." Alistair folded the recovered documents with deliberate care. "No," he answered. "Honesty simply required someone willing to defend it." The annual Royal Benevolence Gala arrived 2 evenings later, filling the magnificent Ashcroft ballroom with England's highest nobility. Crystal chandeliers poured rivers of golden light across polished marble floors while a string orchestra played graceful waltzes beneath painted ceilings. Ladies shimmered beneath diamonds and silk, gentlemen conversed beside towering floral arrangements, and every conversation eventually drifted toward the expected disgrace of Blackthorne's Duchess. Lady Beatrice entered surrounded by admirers, convinced victory already belonged to her. Eleanor accompanied Alistair wearing a simple ivory gown embroidered with delicate roses, refusing extravagant jewels that might distract from the quiet confidence in her bearing. Her calm presence unsettled those who had anticipated visible humiliation. The evening's chairman had barely begun announcing charitable recognitions when Alistair stepped forward. "Before another word is spoken," he declared, his voice carrying effortlessly through the vast ballroom, "truth deserves its rightful place." Music ceased instantly. Every conversation vanished. He placed several leather-bound ledgers upon the central table beside sworn statements bearing official parliamentary seals. One by one he presented the authentic estate accounts, every charitable donation, every financial record, every forged document, and every confession secured during the investigation. Distinguished magistrates confirmed each piece of evidence before the assembled guests. Murmurs spread rapidly as impossible accusations collapsed beneath undeniable facts. Lady Beatrice's composure fractured. "You cannot prove I ordered any of this," she protested. Alistair calmly produced her signed payment instructions addressed to the dismissed accountant. "You financed every lie." Silence answered him. No defense remained. Several noblewomen quietly stepped away from Lady Beatrice, while gentlemen who had praised her judgment only hours earlier refused to meet her eyes. The social exile she had intended for Eleanor settled instead upon herself. Yet Alistair had not crossed London merely to expose deception. He turned toward Eleanor. The grand ballroom seemed to disappear as his attention rested solely upon the woman standing with unwavering dignity despite every wound inflicted upon her name. "When you first came to Blackthorne Hall," he said, "I believed the house would defeat you." His voice softened. "I mistook fear for strength and distance for wisdom." Every listener remained utterly still. "I judged you before I knew your heart." Emotion tightened his words, though he never allowed them to lose their quiet certainty. "You restored hope where I expected obedience. You earned loyalty where I relied upon authority. You taught servants to stand taller, neighbors to trust again, and even an old house to breathe more freely." He reached inside his coat and withdrew the ancient ceremonial ring of the Duchess, along with the heavy silver keys that symbolized stewardship of Blackthorne Hall. "I once imagined these represented power." He gently placed them into Eleanor's hands. "Now I understand they represent trust." The gesture carried greater meaning than any royal proclamation. Before England's most influential families, the Duke publicly acknowledged not merely his wife's innocence but her equal place beside him. Applause began hesitantly, then swelled into a standing ovation that echoed beneath the vaulted ceiling like rolling thunder. Servants watching from distant doorways wiped away tears, while even seasoned statesmen bowed their heads in genuine respect. Eleanor looked at the ring resting against her palm before lifting her eyes to Alistair. "I never wished to conquer your house," she said softly. "I only wished to help it remember joy." For the first time since childhood, Alistair smiled without restraint. Together they walked from the center of the ballroom, no longer separated by expectation or pride but united through hard-earned understanding. Yet as they reached the towering entrance doors, Mr. Graves quietly approached and placed an old brass key into Eleanor's hand. "There is one room," the butler whispered, "that no Ashcombe has entered since the late Duchess passed away. His Grace has carried that locked sorrow for more than 20 years. Eleanor closed her fingers around the weathered key and glanced toward Alistair, whose expression revealed both hope and fear in equal measure. She understood then that exposing lies had never been the greatest victory awaiting them. The hardest door within Blackthorne Hall still remained unopened, and behind it waited the final wound neither kindness nor justice had yet begun to heal. Summer returned to Blackthorne Hall not as a season of ordinary warmth, but as a symbol of everything that had changed within its ancient walls. The same stone towers that had once appeared cold and distant now stood beneath golden sunlight, surrounded by gardens alive with color and laughter. Roses climbed higher than before, fountains sparkled beside newly restored pathways, and the sound of children's voices carried through grounds that had once known only the quiet footsteps of servants fulfilling endless duties. Yet the greatest transformation could not be measured by flowers, accounts, or improvements written upon paper. It lived in the hearts of those who called Blackthorne Hall home. Duke Alistair Ashcombe often found himself standing at the windows of the Western Library, looking across the estate with a strange sense of disbelief. For years he had believed responsibility required distance, that leadership demanded an iron heart untouched by emotion. He had inherited a title, a vast fortune, and a house filled with history, but he had never understood how deeply he had inherited loneliness as well. Eleanor had changed that without ever attempting to change him. She had not broken down his walls through force or demanded affection through expectation. She had simply remained patient enough for him to discover that trust was not weakness and tenderness was not surrender. The locked room in the eastern wing became the final place where old sorrow waited. 4 years it had remained untouched, preserving memories Alistair had been unable to face. Dust-covered childhood toys, faded paintings rested beneath cloth, and forgotten books remained exactly where his mother had left them. When Eleanor turned the brass key and opened the door, she did not rush inside. She stood beside him and allowed him to decide whether he was ready. Alistair stepped forward first. The room smelled of aged wood and lavender, a scent that immediately brought back memories he had buried beneath decades of duty. He found a small wooden horse near the fireplace, the same toy his mother had given him before illness took her away. For a moment, the powerful Duke of Blackthorne disappeared, and Eleanor saw only a young boy who had lost the one person who made the world feel safe. She wanted this room to remain filled with happiness, he whispered. Eleanor looked around at the untouched nursery. Then perhaps it was never meant to remain untouched. Together they restored the room, not by erasing the past but by honoring it. They repaired the broken shelves, polished old furniture, and placed his mother's letters in a beautiful glass case where future generations could read her hopes for the family she loved. What had once been a chamber of grief slowly became a place of remembrance and peace. By midsummer, Blackthorne Hall held its first grand celebration in many years. It was not the kind of gathering designed only for nobles and political influence. Eleanor insisted that the estate gates remain open to everyone who had helped sustain the land. Servants stood beside guests. Tenant families shared tables with aristocrats. Children played beneath the same trees where generations of Ashcombes had walked with prideful distance. Some members of society criticized the changes, claiming Eleanor had weakened tradition. But those who witnessed the celebration understood something far greater had been created. Tradition had not disappeared. It had found a heart. During the festival, Alistair announced new protections for estate workers, including improved housing, medical assistance, and educational opportunities for servants' children. His decision surprised many because the Duke who once guarded every change now willingly embraced progress. When asked why he had altered customs that had existed for generations, he answered simply, "A house that refuses to change eventually becomes a monument to the past. A home must continue living." The words traveled beyond the county. Newspapers that once carried accusations now praised the remarkable transformation of Blackthorne Hall. Yet Eleanor cared little for public admiration. The greatest reward was watching people who once lowered their eyes now walk with confidence. Mr. Edwin Graves observed the scene from beneath the shade of an old oak tree, his silver hair moving gently in the summer breeze. He had served the Ashcombe family through triumphs and tragedies, but never had he seen the estate so alive. "You were right to doubt the Duke," Mrs. Davenport teased him softly. Graves smiled. "I doubted the Duchess would survive the house." He looked toward Eleanor and Alistair walking together among the roses. "I never imagined the house would need her to survive." As evening approached, golden light covered the gardens. Music drifted through open windows while lanterns illuminated pathways leading toward the estate. Eleanor and Alistair escaped briefly from the celebration, finding a quiet corner among blooming roses where the world felt distant. For several moments they simply listened to the peaceful sounds around them. Then Alistair spoke. "Do you regret coming here?" Eleanor turned toward him. The question carried more weight than its simple words suggested. It was not only about Blackthorne Hall. It was about every cold moment, every judgment, every painful beginning. She smiled gently. "When I arrived, everyone believed I had come here to prove myself." She touched one of the roses beside them. "But I never wanted to prove that I was strong enough to endure this place." Her eyes met his. "I wanted to help it become what it was always meant to be." Alistair lowered his gaze, overcome by a feeling he had spent years avoiding. Gratitude. Well, a quiet kind of wonder. "I told Graves you would not last a month," he admitted. Eleanor laughed softly. "And now?" He reached for her hand. "Now I cannot imagine a single day without you." The confession was simple, yet for a man who had built his entire life upon restraint, It was the greatest declaration he could offer. Their marriage had begun as an arrangement shaped by duty, but it had become something far more precious. They had not found love in perfection. They had discovered it through mistakes, forgiveness, patience, and the courage to see each other beyond titles. Years later, travelers passing through the countryside would still speak of Blackthorne Hall. They would describe its magnificent gardens, its beautiful architecture, and its remarkable history. But the story they remembered most was not about wealth. It was about a duchess who entered a house everyone believed would break her and instead filled it with life. It was about a duke who thought pride protected him until love taught him freedom. And it was about the summer when an estate built upon silence finally learned the sound of laughter. Near the entrance hall, where visitors first entered Blackthorne Hall, a small display remained beneath a simple frame. Inside rested the broken pieces of the porcelain tray Eleanor had saved on her first night. Beside it was a handwritten note from Mr. Graves. The day this house stopped fearing mistakes was the day it finally became a home. And beneath the summer sky, with roses blooming and voices rising through the halls, Blackthorne Hall stood as proof that even the oldest walls could be rebuilt, not with stone but with compassion, courage, and a love strong enough to transform everything it touched.